We have our amazing guest, Assal Rad, who amazing writer, amazing political analyst as well. Also our friend here at RBN. Always great to have you on, my friend. Assal Rad. How you doing today?
Thank you, Nick. As well as can be with everything that's happening, but I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, always great to have you on. Do you know how frustrating it is for me as someone who lives in Kansas City and I wanted to celebrate the Super Bowl? I tell you, I'm not really into like team sports. I'm more of a combat sport guy. You know, like boxing, MMA. But I love the community aspect of us winning the Super Bowl. This is like our second year in a row. Like it changes the community. Everyone is super friendly to each other. And people high five each other in grocery stores. I think it's fantastic, man. Guess who couldn't enjoy it? Me, because my brain is broken. And there was what we call the Super Bowl massacre in Rafa during
Yeah,
the
of course.
Super
I mean,
Bowl.
there was the what is an unfortunate thing that happens in this country all too often. I saw someone tweet something like, something to the effect of like, "There's nothing more American than Super Bowl parade and a mass shooting," and it's a terrible thing to say. It really is, but at the same time, that Onion headline that they keep putting every time there's a mass shooting, something like the thing that happens only in one country, there's no way to stop from happening, right? Like it's like the idea that these things keep happening, like you have mass shootings in the US as if there's no way that we can stop them, and yet they only happen in the US. So it's just like such a because I agree with you. I think team sports, I think having that community, local sports, things like that are actually really important to like the fabric of a community, and it's something that we should be able to celebrate. But then when you look at it on Super Bowl Sunday, you have ads in the Super Bowl for foreign countries taking out ads while they're committing war crimes as the Super Bowl is going on, and then you have a Super Bowl parade
Crazy.
where you have a shooting in the U.S. I mean, when you juxtapose all of these things together, it really tells you the sort of like moment that we're in.
I don't think it's a coincidence that we have so many mass shootings when we are the most violent empire in modern human history. We have the most police killings. We send young kids overseas to murder. We murder people with drones. There is no empire that has been more murderous than the United States, or let's keep it simple, 50, 60 years. No one that even come close. I don't think it's a coincidence that the society where violence is always the first answer leads to this population where there's these constant mass shootings. I don't think that's a coincidence at all. I think this is just a reflection of our violent empire, violent, broken society that many people don't talk about, that don't really emphasize about, which leads to the Super
I
Bowl massacre. Go ahead, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's just like I agree with you 100%. Like that, the fact that we don't connect these dots, I think, is one of the things that's really interesting. It's like they're not really isolated incidents. It's all really connected, and the way that you connected them together, I think, really gets to that point. You cannot have a society that carries out so much violence in the world and not think that it's going to affect the culture within that society as well, and it does. And the reason why we carry out so much violence outside of our borders is because we carry out violence inside of our borders. Like these two things are much more connected. Foreign policy and domestic policy are much more connected than I think people realize, but we're starting to see those things click, and I agree with you. It's all connected.
Yeah, foreign policy is starting to become a big decision maker for people in my generation for elections, and it horrifies the establishment. Like they've been talking about this Israel bill. Assault. I don't know how much you've been following this, but liberals are very upset that there's a democracy, that there's not uniform, unanimous decision on foreign spending. They are upset that there's even a debate about this, which shows their overall tendencies. But I want to ask you this because Asal, you wrote this fantastic article a few weeks ago. I read it. You guys know Asal. She does brilliant work, not just on Twitter, but writing these fantastic articles where you explain the devastation that Israel faced at the ICJ. So I want to pass it to you, and I want to get your thoughts on this because Africa now they are keeping the offensive up. Like not like they just had this preliminary trial and now they moved on. No, they are watching them. They're the watchdogs about what's going on in Gaza. Now you have South Africa that says that the Super Bowl massacre on Rafah proved the genocide allegation as if it wasn't already absolutely proven during the ICJ trial. But I want to get your general reaction to South Africa's amazing fight against Israel, this new ICJ probe they're looking to regarding Rafah, and I want you to kind of explain your article as a whole, because there was a lot of, I think, healthy debate on the anti-imperialist left, where there were some people extremely celebrating the ICJ ruling, and there were some people, especially a lot of people in Gaza, like, oh, this shit doesn't do anything. I think both sides of that debate was very healthy. So I would love your perspective, and you can kind of sum up this article that you wrote. Once again, brilliant work, Assal. I would love to hear from you.
I agree with you again. You know, the idea. So I wrote this because I thought there was a lot of reaction, not the reactions from Palestinians, especially Palestinians in Gaza. We cannot judge for one moment how someone in Gaza might feel when they see the ICJ decision, because while I argued in this piece, and I will argue now, that it is a strong rebuke of Israel and the United States and the United States and the West support for Israel. At the same time, it doesn't affect the reality on the ground for Palestinians in Gaza. And so you can't judge them for being angry. They're angry because while these decisions are being made, their lives are still being taken. They're still displaced from their homes. They still don't have access to water and food. So that part of the debate, the fact that it fell short of calling for a ceasefire, what was frustrating was the fact that that was how the Western media sort of presented this whole thing, right? The headline wasn't Israel loses the ICJ, which is what happened. The headline wasn't ICJ finds that Israel's plausibly committing genocide. That's the headline that should be there. All the headlines were, things to the effect of, well, the court doesn't call for a ceasefire. Like, well, what South Africa's case was, right? There was never going to be a decision that day that said whether or not Israel was committing genocide. I mean, this is a legal process. Unfortunately, that process will take years. I mean, just imagine how any basic legal process works in the United States. This is a huge case that has to be tried. You have to present evidence. It's not something that's going to happen within weeks. What South Africa wanted was for this case to move forward, for Israel to be held accountable in the International Court of Justice, and for there to be provisions in order to stop what Israel is doing. And that's precisely what happened. Even the South African defense said, they would have wanted the court to also add the language of ceasefire, and that's really important. They should have done that as well. But when you look at the 6 provisions, when you look at what the ICJ is actually calling for Israel to do, it's basically calling on them to stop killing civilians. Stop killing civilians, make sure that anyone who's inciting violence against civilians, inciting genocide, should be held accountable. That includes Israeli officials. It's calling on them to make sure that humanitarian aid, essential aid like food, is getting in. By the way, Israel is doing none of those things, right? Nothing has changed on the ground. The reality on the ground has not changed. But the ICJ has no mechanism to impose these things, right? The ICJ makes the decision, and then it's third-party states. It's states like the US, like the UK, like France, like Germany, who are supposed to decide based on that decision that they're no longer going to give weapons to Israel as it is pending a case for genocide, which is the ultimate point of the ICJ. Israel is on trial for genocide, and yet we're still giving it our full support, full aid, a country that is on trial for genocide. And that was the main takeaway, in my view, of looking at the ICJ. And it's a rare situation where there's any international accountability for Israel at all. Even if it's in language, even if it's symbolic, it's still a step in a direction that shows, without a doubt, right, all of the people who were denying the fact that what was happening on the ground was genocidal, that the intent is genocidal. It basically flies in the face of all of that. People like John Kirby, who, when they're asked before the ICJ decision, hey, the South Africa has a case against Israel about genocide. People like Blinken and Kirby rejected outright as, what did they call it? Meritless.
Of course.
Right? So that completely flies in the face of the idea that it has merit. The court decided it has merit, and that's why the case is moving forward. Israel wanted that case thrown out of court. Israel did not get its way. So So I think that while you could talk about the ICJ's decision falling short of what we wanted, essentially, if Israel actually listened to the provisions, the situation on the ground would be very different. It's not because Israel doesn't care, because they do not think that they are accountable under the law. And there's a reason why the most powerful country in the world backs them 100%. They're not accountable because the actual mechanisms to hold a state accountable don't do it. So it doesn't matter what the ICJ says as long as the US is still providing Israel with weapons, as long as the US now wants to send 14 billion extra dollars in addition to the billions we already send to Israel. How does that happen? How do we reconcile that with the fact that this country is on trial for genocide? That's why you get the spin. That's why you get the spin in the media, because you can't, the Western world can't indicate its own complicity in the highest crimes that exist in terms of international law so obviously. They can't say, yeah, we know that this is what they're doing, but we're still going to give them weapons anyways. So you see all the spin, and that's really what I wanted to get at, to not let them spin it, to not make it
Yeah,
seem like this is a defeat. This is a victory. Is it enough? No. Is it justice? No. But it's still a victory. And I think it's important to celebrate that while understanding that because the situation on the ground doesn't change, for Palestinians, um, the symbolism doesn't mean anything.
yeah, and I still remember the shameless BBC and Western media completely ignored the entirety of South Africa's devastating critique and argument against Israel. Meanwhile, Israel's unhinged defense that essentially spit in the face of international law because it was so unserious. They broadcast 24/7. And the headlines after the ICJ ruling is what really infuriated me. I saw and I heard from people in Gaza saying how they felt like this didn't protect them, and this led to my very initial scathing critique of this in my first live stream. I heard someone explain this to me, and this is kind of what you explained to as well. When you listen to the ICJ ruling, when they said that they essentially banning Israel from going after and killing civilians, that is essentially a ceasefire because that is all Israel is doing. Anyone who believes that Israel is actually at war with Hamas is either a propagandist or a willing idiot. There is no evidence, my friends, that Israel is at war with Hamas. We need to stop. We need to start asking the ruling class just that simple question. Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence that Israel's at war with Hamas when you have a 98% civilian death rate? And that's going by Israel's numbers. I don't believe Israel killed as many Hamas soldiers as they claim they have. But even if you take their number at face value, 98% civilian death rate, how can anyone say they're at war with Hamas at that point? It's pure terrorism. They are funding genocide, and this is another reason why this ruling is important. And I started siding more on the side of ICJ because, in hindsight, it's foolish to ever thought they had the power to. You know what I mean? That's just me reflecting on my original take. Like, of course, they don't have the power to start a ceasefire, but they start a process. You know what I mean? They're starting this process, and this is something that everyone needs to bring up to every single goddamn Democrat that they ever talk to. Everyone who votes for Joe Biden in this upcoming election is voting for a criminal. Y'all know what Leahy's law is? Leahy's law makes it so it's illegal for a president, or I guess anyone who's in charge of weapon sales, to sell weapons to a country that is committing war crimes. Any country that is caught being complicit with committing genocide, that violates Leahy's law. And there's another law in the book. Let me see if I can find the name of it. I don't know the other one. It's not. There's another law, and this is what Veterans for Peace bringing up, that makes it illegal to sell weapons to terrorist organizations in acts of terror and genocide. Here it is. I found it. What I'm looking for. It said, I'll just read this part. In a scathing letter sent Sunday to State Department officials, Veterans for Peace said that their own investigations into U.S. arms transfer to Israel has found that officials are breaking the law, like the Leahy's Law in the Genocide Convention Implementation Act. That's all. Anything else you want to add before we move on?
Well, that's exactly why you see this level of denial when in White House press briefings and State Department press briefings, the way that they talk about the ICJ, the way that they talk about war crimes being committed, and and the way that the media frames all of that, basically just parroting whatever officials are saying, which is basically the opposite of what the media is supposed to do. Journalists are supposed to question what the state is saying, or then you're just, aren't you then not a free press? Isn't that supposed to be the difference between a democratic country that has a free press versus an authoritarian state that has state-run media? Is that in an authoritarian state where you have state-run media, they just repeat whatever the state says, right? Media is censored. So in the US, we're supposed to have a free media, and yet you see them in many ways, just repeating off whatever state officials are saying, rather than questioning it, rather than presenting exactly these questions, like, how is this not a violation of US domestic law? And so it's just deny everything. But there's no plausible deniability. I mean, you have the ICJ ruling. The decision says that Israel's actions are plausibly genocidal, which means they cannot decide yet in a court case. They cannot decide that it's committed genocide, it's guilty of genocide, because that requires a court process. So what's the first thing they have to do? Determine whether or not the actions are plausibly genocidal in order to have that case. And they've done that. That's happened. We know that right now. And so the only way that the Biden administration can really get around it is to constantly deny everything. Every assessment, they'll say, on one hand, they'll say they're not doing assessments, and then on the other hand, they'll say, well, every assessment they do shows that they've talked to their Israeli counterparts, and that's what they're saying. They have to trust 100% what Israel is saying, even though Israel has been caught in lies over and over and over again, like basic things, right? Basic lies, like posting, using the official Israel handle on X or on Twitter to post misinformation that then gets verified, and then they have to delete, right? So repeatedly they've been caught in lies, and yet we're supposed to trust our administration that says we're just taking Israel's word for it, and that's it. That's all we have to do. No other state would we do that. In every other state, we look for evidence ourselves. We make our own assessments. But in this case, Israel said so it must be true. No, it's because we cannot. There are legal implications, and this is the part that people have to understand. There are legal implications to the US supporting an ongoing genocide.